Good morning, Earth. It's time to get up.
Dial in for strange and wonderful stories told by even stranger and more wonderful people.
And remember, if you've heard it, it's history. If you haven't, it's news. I'm Blue.
And I'm Sky. And welcome to 87.9 WKMU, where you'll find all the things that keep me up.
From gaming and movies to UFOs and just random weirdness in our dimension.
So tune in at wkmu.podbean.com.
Yeah, and do it quick before the government shuts us down. We gotta go, guys. Just make sure you check on yourself and check on your friends.
And everyone deserves love, especially you.
This concludes our broadcast day.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
A common misconception is that people are cleared during investigations. No one can be cleared until there is a conviction or convictions. Doug can't be cleared completely until someone is arrested and convicted, but his alibi was solid and his story completely checks out at this point. So if it wasn't Doug, who was it? George Jared and Jennifer Bucholtz, Silent Silhouette. Who Killed Deborah Sue? Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill, wishing you a very Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah during this jolly holiday season. Yeah, but it can be stressful, so be smart, be situationally aware, and let's enjoy our families and loved ones. I love that Christmas and Hanukkah are occurring at the same time in 2024, so let there be peace on earth and Mazel Tov. This is episode 108, Anger, More Harmful Than the Insult That Caused It, part 1 of Silent Silhouette, Who Killed Deborah Sue, by investigative journalist George Jared and American Military University professor Jennifer Bucholtz. If their names sound familiar to you, George and Jennifer were previously speakers at CrimeCon Las Vegas, and then George joined Bob Ruff and Jim Clemente about the West Memphis 3 case. George's book on the West Memphis 3, which is in West Memphis, was one of my sources for my A Harvest of Innocence series, and it is really very good. Now, fate is a wonderful thing. I met George Jared at CrimeCon 24 in Nashville by admiring his t-shirt. Oh, you want to see the t-shirt? Well, our photo is on my CrimeCon 24 blog post. It's really hilarious, so check that out. But anyway, he came over to my booth on Creators Row, and we got chatting, and the rest is history. New friendships forged, and here we are. I so greatly admire George and his co-author, Jennifer Bucholtz, their methodology in delving into cold cases and trying to shake down new information from the highest part of the most remote trees. Just wait till you hear about this. George has also written true crime books, The Creekside Bones, Reality is More Horrifying Than Fiction, and Whispers in the Willows, Who Killed Rebekah Gould, Who Killed Amanda Tussing, and Why. So read any or all of them. They are very solidly good and critically acclaimed. These are two people who have their heart in the right places when it comes to true crime. The winner of 11 first place awards with the Associated Press Managing Editors and Arkansas Press Association for Investigative Journalism, George is passionate about his work. Co-author Jennifer Bucholtz is an equally consummate professional. A veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, she was in the U.S. Army as a counterintelligence agent. She earned her B.S. in criminal justice at Northern Arizona University and then 2 master's degrees in criminal justice and forensic science investigation. She's currently an instructor at American Military University and contributes greatly to forensic science research and is the host of Break the Case True Crime Podcast. I want to add that George also has his own podcast, Diamond State Murder Board Podcast, and I love them both, so really give them a listen. Kicking off our book club properly, I picked a very Texan appetizer, cowboy corn dip. Now, I am a huge corn fan, whether it's in the summer corn on a cob or corn dip. So I found this recipe from Christy Norrell on 12tomatoes.com. Now, given my last recipe was a little complicated, I felt I owed you an easy one. So you take corn, Mexicorn or Southwestern. I have to admit I made it with a normal can of corn myself. A small can of green chilies, mayonnaise, grated cheese, sour cream, garlic powder, bacon, green onions, salt and pepper to taste. You mix it, and then you refrigerate it until you're ready to serve. Couldn't get much easier than that. Now, I used tortilla chips, and it was absolutely delicious. Creamy, flavorful. I did spice it up with a little red pepper flakes, just a couple shakes, and it was really just perfect. Now, since our cowboy corn dip is fairly rich with natural sugars, a delicious shimmery golden wine from Down Under, the Butterfly Effect Chardonnay 2022, from Sam Plunkett, perfectly accompanies it. Light in body with just enough acidity, it cuts through the richness of the dip. Not really oaky, the Butterfly Effect has a hint of ginger with fruity flavors such as pear and apple. I think you'll really appreciate the range of flavors from both the sip and the dip. And these are our book club treats. Now, I bought my bottle from Naked Wines. You know, it's my favorite club. And it runs about $13 if you are a Naked Wines Angel. The market price is about $18. And I'll have links to the recipe and wine on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, December 2024. So bon appetit, murder bookies, and let's get book club going. We begin Silent Silhouette stepping back in time almost 50 years to August 24th, 1975 in Lubbock, Texas. They were a family celebrating a birthday that night. Joyce Lemons, the birthday boy, her husband Bob, and their 8-year-old daughter Liz headed over to the Pizza Inn restaurant, managed by their new son-in-law, Doug Williamson. En route, they picked up Joyce's 18-year-old daughter by a previous marriage, Deborah Sue, known as Debbie. Sibling Pam did not come with them, being caught up in teenage rebellion. But the family was in a good place. Debbie and Doug had met working at McDonald's in 1973, became engaged, and recently married on June 14, 1974. They moved into the home where Doug had been raised, caring for the house when his parents moved. Recently, Debbie had gotten their wedding proofs back from the photographer, a highlight for any new wife looking back on a wonderful day marking the beginning of her life with Doug. Now remember, this is long before digital photographs from our cell phones. The day before, Debbie, Doug, and another friend, Paul Neal, had a fun outing at Buffalo Springs Lake, which had a long history of cooling people off as the hot summer baked the high plains of Texas. Another couple, Dorothy and Mike Coffin, accompanied the trio. Paul and Debbie had dated in the past, but Debbie never considered them a serious couple. Doug and Paul had been friends for years, with Paul coming over to Doug's house many, many times before. There didn't appear to be any angst between Doug, Debbie, and Paul, although he had not been invited to the wedding. Paul had been out of town, working in the oil fields at the time. He had recently moved back, and Doug had hired him as a cook at the restaurant. Dorothy and Mike had attended the wedding, thinking that this was a terrific couple. 50 years later, Dorothy's recall of Paul at the lake that day was really non-existent, but she did remember a happy Debbie water skiing and having fun. She would tell our authors that Debbie was, quote, an outgoing, bubbly person that everyone liked. She didn't have any enemies, and she never mentioned fearing anything going on in her life, end quote. Paul recalled visiting Joyce and Bob's cabin that day at the lake and that Doug had left early, having to go to work. Debbie departed later in the afternoon, and it had been a lovely outing with nothing out of the ordinary occurring. Getting ready for work on the 24th, Doug showered, with his wife helping to blow dry his long hair. Arriving at the Pizza Inn at 5 p.m., Paul would follow Doug, punching in at 5:14 p.m. Mary Ann Early was the waitress on duty that night. While dining, Liz was trying to maneuver her parents into letting her sleep at Doug and Debbie's that night, something she tried to do often during the summer. But that night, Joyce was having none of it, and about 8 p.m., they dropped Debbie off at home, with Liz in a bit of a snit. They watched Debbie unlock her door, proud of their grown-up daughter, and this was the last time they would ever see Debbie alive. Back at the Pizza Inn, Paul asked Doug if he could leave at 8 p.m., about 2 hours early, as he had a date with Tina McBride, who was also employed there. As Doug got incentives from upper management if he kept the payroll low, he readily agreed, thinking that he could handle the cash register and cooking. But he told Paul he needed to come back later that night to assist with the inventory. It did strike me as a little bit odd that Paul would set up a date in between the time he was working and inventorying, and then he was unsure if he could actually get off or not. That's just a little weird to me. But they wound up busy that night, so in fact, Paul wound up leaving a bit later than he anticipated, clocking out at 8:43 p.m. Then Paul asked Doug if he could take a shower at his house. Doug called Debbie, who was watching the Odd Couple movie on TV, and told her that Paul was coming over to take a shower. But learning that Debbie was home, Paul changed his mind, going over to his parents' house instead. His parents were not home at the time. Now, surprisingly, the Sunday night rush did not dissipate as anticipated. Doug called Debbie, asking her to come over and lend a hand, which she did on occasion. Now, Debbie had already planned to come back, as Doug had borrowed $140 from the register to buy a CB radio. The inventory they had to do couldn't be completed until the $140 was back in the till. Now, there is nothing nefarious about this. It was just the Pizza Inn culture at the time. Then time began to pass without Debbie arriving, and Doug called her on a landline around 10 p.m. There was no answer. In a little bit, he called again. There was no answer, and Mary Ann could sense his growing concern. Friend and jack of all trades, Lex Brown, arrived around 11 p.m. to help with the inventory. He and Doug had an arrangement that Lex would help out on occasion, like the inventory, and in return, he would eat for free. And both Lex and Paul would later confirm this $140 till story. Now, normally, Doug would also go make the night deposit, but he was unable to leave Mary Ann alone with the rush continuing. And after yet another call was unanswered, Doug called Debbie's mom, Joyce, and learned no, Debbie wasn't there. They had dropped her off, and they didn't know where she was now. Now, this is not completely unusual in the 1970s. We didn't have cell phones to keep tabs on everybody where they were 24/7. But by 1 a.m., Doug had had enough and wanted to go home and check on his wife, because their house was only 5 minutes away. And he left Lex and Mary Ann back at the Pizza Inn. Paul would arrive back at the restaurant just minutes after Doug left. Paul and Tina's date began when he arrived at her house around 10 p.m. Tina would tell the police that his hair was wet when he arrived, smelling like soap, not pizza. They left to go hang out at McDonald's with some friends, and Paul would take her home around midnight and then head back to do the inventory with Doug. Arriving home, it was very dark. From the driveway, Doug could see the outdoor light was off and the mudroom door was open. Very odd, as anxiety began to swell in the darkness. Then he spied a broken screen on the kitchen window, faintly illuminated from inside. As Doug walked through the carport, about 25 feet or 7.5 meters, and tripped, to his horror, over Debbie's body. Blood pooled in the carport and patio. Her shirt was pulled up. Her pants were pulled down, exposing her breasts and genitals. Shocked, senseless, petrified, Doug bolted, trembling as he tried to contact the police on his CB, but with it failing to go through. Screeching into the Pizza Inn parking lot, he banged on the door, with Lex running over to let him in. Quote, "Debbie's been raped," end quote, Doug shouted, rushing to the phone. He stammered he tried to wake her up, but there was no response. With Doug on the phone, Paul and Lex rushed over to the Williamson house, peering, cautiously approaching Debbie's body, with Lex gently checking for a pulse. But there was none. Returning outside, they waited for the police. Minutes later, Doug arrived, pacing nervously, wanting the police to hurry up. Later, Paul and Lex's statements to police would differ slightly. Unlike Lex, Paul told the police that he had gone into the house to see if the killer or killers were still there. Well, the police arrived, as did Joyce and Bob Lemons, with Bob tearing past everyone and running to the girl he considered to be his daughter, and he was stricken by the gruesome sight. Joyce also ran towards her daughter, but was stopped by Paul and Doug, who told her that Debbie was dead. Moving slightly closer, Joyce saw the blood on the side of Debbie's Plymouth Duster and fainted. She was carried to the back of a police car, and a bit later, Paul and Lex would leave. Lost and bewildered, Doug and Bob eventually returned to the Lemons house. Liz Flatt would tell the Lubbock Avalanche Journal in 2017, quote, "The next recollection in reference to that was my dad woke me up, kneeling beside my bed, and Debbie's husband was there, and they were trying to explain to me that Debbie had been killed," end quote. Liz wound up wondering if only she had found a way to stay over that night, she may have somehow prevented it. And this still, to this day, crosses her mind almost 5 decades later. And I just want to say, Liz, this was not your fault. This is totally owned by the killer. The next few days were clouded with grief and disbelief as they lurched from one activity to the next. A visit to the funeral home, Debbie's autopsy being conducted, interviews by the police. A suspect emerged, Debbie's older brother, Ricky, who had drug difficulties and previous run-ins with the law. He admitted to a testy relationship with his sister, but he had nothing to do with the murder. But this did not alleviate suspicions about him. A reporter showed up at the Lemons home, speaking with Doug, who told them that whoever killed his wife must have known her. Quote, "Whoever it was had to know I was at work and she was at home alone," end quote. Bob would also speculate that the killer was familiar with the house. August 27th, as the rain fell, Reverend Richard Cheatham of the Elgin Avenue Baptist Church conducted Deborah Sue Williamson's funeral service. Laid in a silver and blue casket, Debbie wore white, the same ones she'd worn when Reverend Cheatham had married her and Doug less than 3 months before. The chapel was packed, with Paul serving as a pallbearer. The night before, Doug had asked his best man, Lennis Terry, Paul, and Lex to go to their house to retrieve some photos for the service. Uncomfortable going there alone, the men asked a police officer to accompany them. Lennis would say that the house was orderly, that no struggle had taken place here, nor was there any blood visible. Our authors deduce that this is when they realized that the wedding proofs that Debbie has been so excited about were missing. Police dispatch reports indicate that Doug's 911 call came in at 1:14 a.m., August 25, 1975. He said his wife had been raped and he'd left her by the back door of their home. Asked why he'd left the scene, he told the dispatcher he was afraid the attacker was still in the house. But why would Doug say Debbie had been raped? Mary Ann, the waitress, explained that it was clear that Debbie was dead and that Doug just couldn't speak the words. Lubbock patrol officers arrived at the residence about 1:20 a.m., met by Doug, Paul Neal, and Lex Brown. Doug was visibly shaken and panicked. Officer Holden moved to the carport, noting the wide pool of blood between the cars and the wall of the home. Bloody drag marks extended from the carport to the back step. He detected no pulse, noting she was partially in rigor mortis and that she had been dead for several hours. Glancing, the officer noted that the carport was slightly illuminated from a light in the kitchen. The storm door was closed, but the home's back door was open. A word search puzzle magazine partially covered Debbie's right arm, dragged along with her body. Her bloody keys were found nearby, likely tangled in her hair when the killer had moved on her. But why would the killer move her body? The officer surmised that a garden hoe had been used to break the window, like an attempted burglary. Shortly thereafter, the rest of the cavalry arrived. More police, a justice of the peace, homicide detectives, and even a judge. While Debbie's clothing had been pushed up to expose her, her boots, stockings, rings, a wedding and engagement ring, a promise ring from Doug, and her high school class ring were undisturbed. To determine if anything was missing from the house, Bob was escorted through, finding nothing amiss. He did note that 2 wet towels hung from the shower curtain rod. There were no other signs of forced entry. All the doors and windows were locked. Outside in the gravel alley, a tire track and shoe print were spotted. Unfortunately, the police botched their effort to make plaster molds of them. But photographs were taken, and they learned the tire prints were a Uniroyal Tiger Paw brand. Now, in the 1970s, this was a common tire used on passenger and muscle cars. It was not left by the weekly trash truck that drove down the alley next to the Williamsons' house once a week. Now, Doug explained that no one drove down the alley except the garbage truck, so it was likely that this tire print was left by the killer. Photos were taken of blood spatter and smears on Debbie's side of the car, which was locked. She had never had a chance to unlock it. Debbie's purse was missing, likely stolen by the murderer. Doug suggested that the wedding proofs may have been in Debbie's purse. Had the killer wanted these photos for some reason? In the patio area, a bloody fingerprint and palm print were taken into evidence. Glass fragments from the kitchen window laid atop the blood trail, which indicated that it had been broken after the homicide occurred, a sign of classic staging. Haha. A light bulb lay atop one of the patio chairs. Had the killer removed it, deliberately making the area darker? Well, probably, as Debbie was consistent in turning the light on whenever she left at night. As police continued to process the crime scene, others were canvassing the neighborhood. Back at St. Mary of the Plains Hospital in Lubbock, Texas, the autopsy was conducted. The report indicated 3 medical conditions that led to Debbie's death, all stemming from the 17 stab wounds she received. First, stabbed in the chest, both lungs were punctured, 6 on the left, 5 on the right. This is pneumohemothorax. That is, both lungs collapsed, and she wouldn't have been able to breathe properly or cry out for help. Second, Debbie was stabbed through her armpit into the right atrium of her heart, which receives blood flow from the veins, which circulates it through the body. This resulted in massive internal hemorrhaging and rapid blood loss, which explains the huge pools of blood at the crime scene. And this is usually a fatal wound by itself. Finally, all of these injuries contributed to the last cause of death, exsanguination, severe blood loss. Over 2 liters of blood were removed from Debbie's lungs alone. This massive pooling of blood, combined with a compromised ability to breathe, while her heart is still beating and continuing to circulate blood, with adrenaline coursing through Debbie's body due to the attack. The pathologist also noted bruising and abrasions on her knees, elbows, and chin. Jennifer Bucholtz writes that she had 3 foreign strands of hair, quote, clutched in one hand. Investigators believe the hair belonged to her attacker, but the forensic analysis has not yet identified its source, end quote. Brown, the strands were 6 inches in length. And FYI, Brother Ricky had light blonde hair. Just saying. Debbie had also been stabbed through her garments. On collapsing on the ground, they were deliberately shifted, exposing her breasts and genitals. Stabbed 17 times, there were injuries to her scalp, both sides of her torso, 10 to her back, 7 to the front, and she had a long slash to her cheek. At first, detectives hypothesized that this had been a sexual assault. A rape kit was conducted, and testing concluded that she had not been raped. Quote, sexual assault was ruled out as a motive, end quote. Her clothing and fingernail scrapings were among the evidence processed. Likely surprised by the initial attack, this being totally unexpected, and it would take a second for someone to realize that they are being attacked, right? Well, then Debbie offered some resistance, not a lot, and was subdued quickly, with the killer controlling her. Now, reading this report in detail, there's still a lot of questions that arose, and many concerned the crime scene itself. So George and Jennifer realized they needed to make the road trip to Lubbock, Texas, to see the terrain for themselves. Now, Lubbock detectives began at the most logical place, interviewing the grieving husband. You know, we laugh and we always say, it's always the husband, but is it? Well, Doug told the detectives he'd last spoken to Debbie around 9 p.m. At home, she was watching The Odd Couple and had seemed perfectly fine. Working that night at the Pizza Inn, Doug said it was very busy and he never left. And Mary Ann concurred. She had not been left to cook, waitress, and run the cash register all alone. Doug was there all night. Coupled with the fact that the night's deposit was not made, because the money was found in the cash register, Doug had a solid alibi. Then, Doug voluntarily took 2 polygraphs. According to the examiner, there was no deceptive reaction to any of the questions, like, did he know where the murder weapon was? Or did he know where Debbie's purse was? Doug did not. But he showed deception when he was asked, quote, did you kill Debbie? End quote. Now, wait a minute. This is actually not unusual given his close relationship with the victim. But nevertheless, a second polygraph was administered, which confirmed the first results. Paul and Lex were also polygraphed. Paul on September 12, 1975. Paul recounted his activities that night at the Pizza Inn, leaving, showering at his parents' home, arriving at his dates around 10, and then arriving back a few hours later at the Pizza Inn to help with the inventory. Now, by then, Lex was there, and Doug had just left to go check on Debbie. Lex and Paul both agreed that when Doug arrived back, he was frantic, panicked, yelling that Debbie had been raped. Paul asked, quote, where Debbie was and whether she was alone, end quote. Learning she was, Lex and Paul raced over the house, finding her lying bloodied by the car. Paul said that he and Lex both entered the house to see if the killer was in sight, but found the house empty. Then Doug arrived, joining his friends to wait for the police. Paul was asked about his previous dating relationship with Debbie, and he explained that Debbie was terrific and he had no ill will towards her. Most of the summer of 75, he had been away working and had only returned to Lubbock a week or 2 before Debbie's death. They were all good friends, although he never went to the house unless Doug was present. Paul told them the day before they had all gone to Buffalo Springs Lake together. He insisted that he and Debbie got along fine, but recently there were times when she ignored him. Now, police asked Paul why he wanted to use the Williamsons' shower instead of his home, and his reasoning is really murky. They never really got a clear-cut answer on that, but what was known is that after Paul realized Debbie would be home alone, he canceled the request. When Paul spoke recently with George, he admitted that he failed one polygraph and wasn't sure about the results of the second. Now, taking 2 polygraphs is not really all that unusual. Paul did cooperate. He supplied fingerprints and hair samples, and he said he had no idea who might have killed his ex. Lex was interviewed on August 26, 1975, and he explained his role assisting Doug at the restaurant as necessary, and thus had no time card for that evening. He had arrived around 10:50 p.m. to help with the inventory. Asked about Paul's timeline, he affirmed that Paul had planned to leave at 8 o'clock, but was waylaid by the crowd that had arrived, and that he left about 8:45 p.m. Paul had arrived back there about 1 a.m. Lex told police that Doug was very concerned about Debbie, who hadn't answered his repeated phone calls to her. After Doug returned, he and Paul had raced over where Lex had checked Debbie's pulse and found none. Now, some tidbits from Lex's statements. Debbie planned to come back to the Pizza Inn to help with the inventory that was carried out every Sunday night. And at one time, Lex and Debbie had gone to prom together, but there had never been any kind of serious relationship. Also, Doug's ex-girlfriend had given Debbie some friction in the past, but Lex didn't know any details. Like Paul, Lex also provided fingerprints and hair samples. Shown a lineup of some potential Pizza Inn customers, Lex didn't recognize any of them. Joyce and Bob Lemons also spoke with the police, them being the last people who had seen Debbie alive. Their stories were similar, recounting dinner at the Pizza Inn with Liz and leaving with Debbie around 8 p.m. However, they both expressed concerns about Paul. Ricky, Debbie's brother, was also questioned extensively on August 29th. Rumors were rampant about his drug use and estrangement from the family. The reality of the depth of Ricky's drug use was not really known, but he did argue with Debbie over it, with her having none of it. On occasion, she had said she was afraid of Ricky, but he claimed that recently he and Debbie had become closer, though he had not seen her in the past few weeks. He absolutely denied that he had killed her, and he had never even owned a knife. Administered a polygraph, the results were inconclusive. And like the others, Ricky also provided hair samples and fingerprints. Additional family members, bridesmaids, groomsmen were interviewed, plus other Pizza Inn employees, friends from her social group, and from Coronado High School. None had anything negative to say about Debbie, nor could they think of anyone who had a gripe against her. It was possible that Debbie may have received some phony phone calls that were threatening, but no specifics were known. And just like that, the investigation went cold. "46 years later, George Jared received 2 emails that trigger the next part of this story. But a little context first. On or about September 20th, 2004, 22-year-old college student Rebekah Gould went missing. Now, George was a reporter, and he covered the story for a local newspaper, and he and his wife joined in on the search effort. A week after Rebekah had gone missing, her body was found, dumped in a remote spot along a highway. Beaten to death, Rebekah was murdered. She was killed at a friend, Casey McCullough's home near Guion, Arkansas. And George would include chapters about this unsolved murder in his books, with this case frustratingly cold. Now, in early 2018, George received an email from Catherine Townsend, the journalist who launched the Hell and Gone podcast, which garnered a great deal of attention and is really very good. George agreed to speak to Catherine about the Rebekah Gould case. Meanwhile, George would spend an inordinate amount of time responding to posts on a Facebook page he created on the Rebekah Gould case, answering questions often well into the wee hours. Now, across the country, just after Christmas 2018, Jennifer Bucholtz began listening to the Hell and Gone podcast about Rebekah Gould's case and was compelled to email George, hers among the hundreds of emails that were filling his inbox. But Jennifer's email was professional and serious, and George thought she might make a really good contact with her divergent background and skill set. After a 4-hour conversation, the rest is history. Jennifer and her husband visited Arkansas, with George arranging a meeting with Rebekah Gould's father, Dr. Gould, and eventually Arkansas's lieutenant governor and the FBI. They also met with a large group of supporters eager to assist in Rebekah's case. They would all interact on a Facebook page called The Unsolved Murder of Rebekah Gould, with thousands joining the page eager to help crowdsourcing the investigation of Rebekah's murder. One of these crowdsourcers was William Miller, a first cousin of Casey McCullough, who was the friend Rebekah was visiting when she died. Many posts later, George and Jennifer realized that Miller was in Guian visiting family the weekend before the murder. Well, suspicions elevated as George and Jennifer and the others began looking into his possible involvement in the homicide. Endless hours of researching later, on November 7th, 2021, William Miller was brought in for questioning and confessed to Rebekah's murder. He was arrested and charged. Another George Jared book on the Gould case is forthcoming, so please stay tuned, and we'll talk about that one too. Anyway, it was the Gould case that George and Jennifer would present to CrimeCon Austin, and there they would connect with Elizabeth Flatt, called Liz, Debbie's little sister. Okay, so it's kind of a way around, but we got there. Now, coincidences are funny things. George was already aware of Elizabeth Flatt because she had participated in the Netflix documentary, The Confession Killer, on Henry Lee Lucas. Now, if you have any interest in serial murderer Henry Lee Lucas, you definitely need to watch this. I give it 5 murder books out of 5. Well, after his arrest, Lucas would confess to hundreds of murders across the United States in the 1970s and 80s, with law enforcement eager to believe him and just as eager to close many cold cases. Quote, "I've killed him every way there is except poison," end quote, said Lucas. Cooperating with law enforcement, Lucas went on national tour, enjoying endless strawberry milkshakes as he confirmed murder after murder, tipping at approximately 360. Texas Rangers and law enforcement across the country were elated. And then they came to Lubbock, Texas, and he confessed to murdering Deborah Sue Williamson. Shocked, after 9 years, Joyce, Bob, and the family were relieved at first, but then they learned the details of his confession, which did not match with the known facts. For example, Lucas said he came into Debbie and Doug's house through the sliding glass doors, which was impossible. Joyce knew that a large curio cabinet was placed against those doors, making any entry impossible. And the contradictions continued. George writes, quote, "When Bob confronted him face to face, Lucas admitted he was a liar," end quote. Well, gee, a serial killer lying to get attention. Who could have seen that one coming? Well, unbelievably, Joyce and Bob would have to fight hard to prove that Lucas's confession to authorities was a lie, which seems terribly unnecessary and antagonistic to me, and downright ridiculous. I mean, facts are facts. Either he was the killer and knew what happened, or he didn't. And Lucas did not know what happened, so this is all so unnecessary. Again, my heart goes out to the families that have to endure this stuff. Well, in the aftermath of CrimeCon Austin, With Rebekah's case now slowly moving through the legal system, George and Jennifer began discussing which case to do next, going through their checklist requirements. The case had to have support from the family. They had to be able to gain access to some of the original files, reports, photographs, and the like. And then finally, the case had to be solvable. And this is when they settled on the case of Deborah Sue Williamson, almost 50 years old, but this can be solved. They arranged a Zoom call with Debbie's sister, Liz, one of the last people to see Debbie alive in 1975. Liz was clearly frustrated at the lack of progress in the case, and who wouldn't be 5 decades later? Once Lucas was excluded as the killer, law enforcement repeated the usual platitudes. This case was frozen solid. Liz took George and Jennifer through the last few days and hours prior to Debbie's murder, discussing the evidence. They kicked around theories, and Liz confided that Debbie was fearful of the dark, afraid of being attacked or raped. She'd be afraid to go into the kitchen at night in the dark, so Liz did not believe that Debbie would have gone outside to the carport without turning on the light first. Liz herself had spoken with some of the others who were on the scene that night and had collected newspaper clippings and other documents. One person who hadn't returned her calls was Paul Neal, and it annoyed Liz greatly. Now the podcasters and Liz had a frank discussion about his request to shower, as well as his statements to police. They talked about older brother Ricky, and Liz was honest. Quote, "If he did it, expose him," end quote. Next, George and Jennifer made contact with the husband, Doug Williamson, as Liz still had his phone number, which had a Missouri area code. Doug was welcoming and invited George over to speak in person. Asked where he lived, George realized they were literally a couple hours drive apart, just having to cross from Arkansas into Missouri. George learned that after Debbie's murder, Doug had lived with the Lemons for several months. He would eventually move to Arkansas, where he went to college, earning his teaching certification at the Arkansas State University. Driving to Doug's with his podcast producer, Andrew Brown, they realized that Doug was living in the sticks, with them riding around in circles with spotty cell phone reception for what seemed an eternity. They would eventually get there. Doug was tall, friendly, and laid back, wearing a hat. Remarried, his wife Karen also warmly welcomed them. Settling down around the kitchen table, Jennifer would join them via conference call. Doug told them he'd met Debbie working at McDonald's, and that Paul Neal had dated her, but they soon broke it off. By September, Debbie and Doug were going together, and Doug smiled, recalling that Debbie, quote, "always had her sights on me," end quote. A friend and co-worker of Doug and Debbie's from back in the day, Mark Holmes, was also interviewed and confirmed that Debbie was crazy about Doug, who was managing McDonald's at the time. They clearly felt strongly about each other. Mark also shared that Paul Neal still had feelings for Debbie and continued to talk about her a lot. Debbie, Doug, and Paul worked together frequently, but it all seemed amicable enough. They also asked Mark about Doug and Paul's relationship, which he described as a deep friendship. Doug, Paul, Lex, and Doug's best man, Lennis Terry, all hung out together, golfing, bowling. When Doug left McDonald's to take the managerial job at Pizza Inn, Paul went to work in the oil fields. Asked why Paul wasn't invited to the wedding, Doug really couldn't recall. And that tells me it wasn't a big emotional issue or a big decision, because then Doug would remember it. August 7th, 1975, Paul had returned to Lubbock, with Doug giving him the job at the Pizza Inn as assistant manager and cook. Asked about Paul's shower request that night, Doug just didn't recall the details. Referring to the reports from them, Doug could give no further explanation as to why Paul asked to shower at his house instead of his parents', which was only a few minutes further away. Doug said that this didn't seem unusual because Paul had been over so many times. Doug and Paul never discussed the murder afterwards. Once Doug moved, they didn't speak for almost 20 years. Now, this might strike you as odd at first, but it's not that unusual. The intense grief, the whole emotional upheaval of losing a wife so unexpectedly after just 10 weeks of marriage, friendships may be strained in the aftermath. Spouses can feel isolated, misunderstood, as friends struggle for something to say to be helpful, having no idea what that is. And this results in friends distancing themselves when they just cannot deal with the depth of this loss and seeing their friend in pain. It may seem counterintuitive, but this definitely happens, and it seems that it may have happened in this case. In 1993, so like 18 years later, Doug was in Lubbock and met up with Paul again, with the two going to a strip club to visit a girl Paul was dating. And this was the last time they had spoken. Doug understood that he was a suspect, being the closest person to Debbie. He had been extensively interrogated and had taken those 2 polygraphs, which he passed with that one caveat. Doug admitted he'd failed one question, quote, "When they asked me if I did it, if I killed her, they said I failed that question, but they told me I would have had to fail a bunch of other questions leading up to that one," end quote. George, Jennifer, and I all appreciate his honesty. Asked why Doug said Debbie had been raped when he arrived back at the Pizza Inn, Doug explained he'd been in shock after finding her, and his memory was hazy, almost blank after that. Had Debbie been fearful of anything or anyone? And he said no, he wasn't aware of anything. But his ex-girlfriend Susan had been upset that he and Debbie had begun to date. But he knew of no deep animosity between them. Doug hadn't known Susan's friends or family all that well because they hadn't dated that long. Doug was adamant about one thing, though. The killer had to know them and was familiar with the house and grounds. He had to know that Doug was at work and that Debbie was alone. Quote, "I don't think this was a random act," end quote. Reluctant to speculate, Doug said he'd wondered about Ricky for years because Debbie had been critical of his lifestyle and drugging and was always hounding her for money to buy more, with Debbie refusing. She just wasn't going to support his habit. Asked about Lex Brown, Doug admitted he hadn't spoken to Lex since the murder either. Murder, trauma, shock, a killer on the loose, and friendships are strained, dissolving. And in spite of their friendship, Doug actually didn't seem to know a whole lot about Lex. So, Lex. In Lex's interview with the police, he said that he and Debbie had gone on a few dates before she dated Paul, with them attending prom together. And it appeared that Doug may not have known this. And this would continue to pop up as George and Jennifer investigated. Kind of 6 degrees of separation, I guess. Doug said he was not contacted by Netflix when The Confession Killer was released. And he hadn't spoken to the police in 45 years. Though his father was a Lubbock Fire Department captain who did get regular updates from detectives, and then he would relay information back to Doug. And then the interview wrapped up with Andrew and George thanking Doug and Karen for their time and hospitality, departing on good terms. On the drive back, the man began to review what Doug had said. He certainly knew he was the number one suspect, as most women are murdered by someone close to them, whether a spouse, a boyfriend, or someone infatuated. By reviewing the case files, they knew that Doug was really not a viable suspect in the eyes of police. But, as I said in the open, no one is actually cleared until there is an arrest and a conviction. So if not Doug, who killed Debbie and why? Well, the next step was to go to the scene of the crime. Jennifer writes that she was meeting George in Lubbock. They knew they would be making a podcast on Debbie's case, so she lugged all of the cameras, audio, video, recording equipment with her. Jennifer was eager to meet with Liz and Paula in person, appreciating their support. Being cautious, They kept their trip a secret so as not to alert the killer. And they were concerned that if word got out, some witnesses might shut down and refuse cooperation. And Jennifer hoped to snag an interview with Paul Neal. Paul was the other obvious suspect. He had dated Debbie after all. He was familiar with her home, exterior and interior, as he'd practically grown up there. And if you hadn't noticed, and this is important, Paul does not have an alibi for the time of the murder. Speaking to him before he caught wind of the seriousness of their investigation was critical. En route to Lubbock, Jennifer planned to call Paul. She was in a one-party recording state, and she would be the one party that knew. Settling down, she dialed, and Paul Neal answered. Jennifer introduced herself, stressing she was a professor of forensics at American Military University and part of the volunteer cold case team, working with students to solve murder cases, and skipped over her military and investigative background entirely. She was collecting background information on Deborah Sue Williamson's murder, and his name had come up because he was one of the eyewitnesses. And then she launched into her first question. Quote, "What can you recall about the crime scene when you went out to the house that night?" End quote. And crickets. Paul was silent for so long she thought he'd hung up. But finally he responded, but it wasn't really cohesive. So I'm going to paraphrase now. He said Doug, a friend of his, went up there as he was checking on Debbie. So they drove out there and parked. And they both had been out there many times before. You just go in and out of the carport area. And when they went that way, and it was dark, maybe 11 or 11:15, and there was just enough light to see Debbie lying there in a pool of blood. Okay, so if you were not already familiar about the sequence of events that happened that night, that would probably leave you utterly confused. But fortunately, Jennifer knew and kind of could follow along. And the rambling went on. Quote, "Lex, a friend, was in there too, and he bent down checking for a pulse or something. Then both jumped up and ran into his car and took off back. There were no cell phones, and Lubbock wasn't that big, so you could go pretty fast. And we went to his place of business and told Doug to call the police. But they weren't there that long, and he worked for Doug. And he said he'd stay and help finish up what he was doing. Well, he was a manager, but Doug was like the general manager. And he thought he'd stay there. And Doug and Lex went back there. But at some point, he went back there because he remembers the police." End quote. What? I mean, what? All right, so that's just not accurate. We know that. Because once Paul and Lex were at the crime scene, they never returned back to the Pizza Inn. They were with Doug when the police arrived, and their statements clearly stated that. Now, to be fair, maybe Paul had forgotten some critical details. It is 46 years later. But nevertheless, Jennifer pressed on. It was very dark, and Paul had no idea about any of the evidence found by the police. He and Lex were likely in shock too. And then Paul said that neither he nor Lex went into the Williamson house and that they waited outside for police. Well, wait, we know that's false. Paul had specifically said he entered the house in his statement. Mixing this up seems kind of unlikely. So what the heck is going on with Paul? Well, he went on to recount his friendship with Doug and Debbie and the neighborhood and memories of working together at McDonald's, and he skipped over the fact that he and Debbie had dated. Asked if he had a theory about the murder, Paul said that Ricky and Henry Lee Lucas were suspects. Now, he was especially curious to know if the police had ever determined if the killer had gone inside the home before or afterward. Well, Jennifer only noted this, not replying. The truth was, she and George had serious suspicions that the killer had gone inside and used the sink or the shower to clean up after the murder, and she did not share this with Paul. Then he asked her whether DNA testing had been conducted on any of the evidence. He seemed surprised when Jennifer said no, that it had not been. and she told him they hoped to work with the police to help and get the evidence to the best DNA lab they could find with the newest technology to re-examine it, which would hopefully identify a killer. Now, after this conversation, Jennifer initially had good feelings about Paul. They had spoken for 37 minutes and closed by sharing cell phone numbers. It was only after reviewing Paul's answer, his choice of language, misremembering, that nagging doubts emerged. When she called George to share her insights, he was actually at Buffalo Lake, hiking around a trail, retracing the steps taken by Debbie and Doug and their friends 46 years ago to the day. Filling him in, George, who, let's face it, is a veteran journalist and very skeptical, was now very skeptical, even for George, about Paul's inconsistencies. What are you thinking now, murder bookies? All right, well, long drive over, Jennifer and George finally meet up in their hotel, with them speaking into the night about the recordings, the statements, the details, the theories. The next part of their plan, they would meet with Debbie's sisters, Liz and Paula, next. Now, Liz and Paula had kind of grown up together. Paula's father and Debbie's mother had gotten together when Paula was in elementary school, and she and Debbie were basically the same age. They loved TV shows like The Monkees, singing Last Train to Clarksville in the middle of the living room. Paula stressed how nice Debbie was. Living in Minnesota when Debbie was murdered, Paula's dad had told her to avoid Ricky if he ever showed up on the scene. Well, she didn't attend Debbie's funeral because it would have been just too overwhelming, and George and Jennifer could hear the sadness in her voice thinking back. Liz told them that she and Ricky never discussed their sister's death. It was just off limits. And Liz felt guilty that the family had ostracized Ricky for so long, with the police hinting that he could be a killer. It wasn't until right before Ricky committed suicide in 1990 that Joyce and he reconnected. Pam, their other sister, had looked for him and found him trying to make amends. It just seems so sad that a child is murdered and they wind up losing another one as a result. Just heartbreaking. Well, it had been a long day with the stress of recalling painful memories evident. Everyone left to go get some sleep. And it was only the next morning that Jennifer learned that George and Liz had spent another hour talking standing next to the car, just unable to stop once the memories began to flow. The next day would be the most significant of their trip, going to the crime scene, to the exact spot where Debbie had died 46 years ago, on the anniversary of her death. Truly powerful. And this is where I will wrap up episode 108, Anger, More Harmful Than the Insult That Caused It. Part 1 of Silent Silhouette, Who Killed Deborah Sue, by George Jarrett and Jennifer Bucholtz. If you know anything that could be important to the case, please call Crime Line at 806-74-1000 or directly to the Lubbock Police Department at 806-775-2865. If this episode has stirred a long slumbering memory, a recollection of a conversation, anything that could be helpful, please reach out. Episode 109, A Shower of Troubles, Part 2, will drop in 2 weeks, and we will see George and Jennifer's investigation deep dive, speaking to people never before interviewed about Debbie's murder, revealing much that was not known. Now, recently, my Patreon group and I chose our next book by journalist B.R. Bates and Gerald Cliff, The Baby Doll Serial Killer, The John Eric Armstrong Homicides. Wait, who? John Eric Armstrong? Yeah, I had never heard of him either. And he was such a nice guy, quiet and reserved, nicknamed Opie. an homage to the red-haired freckled child character from the Andy Griffith Show, played by director Ron Howard back in the day. Soft, sensitive. John Eric Armstrong was never in trouble, but Eric, as he was known, had a malignant force inside him, concealed from family, friends, indeed the whole outside world. Trolling for prey on Detroit's prostitution alley, Michigan Avenue, Eric picked up women who were taken in by his boyish demeanor, never to be heard from again. This true crime book by R.B. Bates and Gerald Cliff, who was the head of this investigation law enforcement, has so many details. It is so incredibly comprehensive, you feel you are a part of the team rather than a reader or a listener. So do not miss my next book, The Baby Doll Killer, out around the new year. And my reviews of it are on Goodread, Amazon, and on my blog. Thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. Share my podcast with friends and family. Leave an awesome review after listening. And I appreciate you being with me on this journey into the cases, the updates, the analysis on the best true crime books out there. Join me or let me read for you. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, or join me at Patreon for $4 a month and help select the next books I'll feature. See you in 2 weeks.
We're Seismic Cinema. I'm Colin. I've probably not seen it. Paul's watched it in the wrong order.
And I'm James, and I've probably written an essay on it. And that's Seismic Cinema. We believe in the power of escapism.
Oh, thank God for that. That'll do.
And this massive pooling of blood, combined with the compromised ability to breathe while her heart was still beating, continuing to circulate blood with adrenaline. I'll get this. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.